Hey bead friends, it's Lauren Harpster from Bead and Blossom. We are working through my Learn French Beading Intermediate Techniques series where we are learning how to build on top of and alter the techniques that I taught in my beginner course in order to make different kinds of shapes. I am going to be assuming throughout this series that you are already familiar with the techniques that I taught in my beginner course, so if you are not, I will have a link to that playlist in the description below. I'll also have a link down there where you can download a free PDF packet for my intermediate technique lessons. This is lesson 7, part 1, where we're going to start learning about the bent basic frame technique, which is basically making three-dimensional shapes on a basic frame by bending the frame wires in various directions. Now, this video is part 1. We're going to be talking about these dome shapes, which most people call beehives, and then also we're going to talk a little bit about the boats because it's generally the same process, just with a longer basic row. So I'm going to demonstrate with the domes, and then we'll talk about the boats. And then these shapes, these little cup petal shapes, we're going to talk about in part 2. The sample pattern that we'll be working with today is a 13-row bent basic frame with a 1-bead basic row. We'll be wrapping round bottom and round top. After row 5, we're going to be bending the top and bottom wires back 90 degrees before wrapping the remaining rows. Then we're going to reduce to one bottom wire, and we're going to leave the top wire attached in order to make the stem in the middle of our dome. I've got size 11 seed beads strung onto 26 gauge copper core wire, and with these little domes or beehives, you can work directly off the spool as long as you're using just one color of beads, so I can just leave my wire attached so I have a continuous feed of wire. Now with these little domes, when you're using them as a flower center, you do want to leave your top wire fairly long because that top wire is going to become part of a little stem wire that will be used to attach the little dome to your flower stem. So we're going to make our top wire a little bit longer than we normally would. In this case, I've got like 2 inches of wire there above. Might be a little bit more than what I need, but I'd rather more than less. Alright, so I've got 1 bead pulled out for my basic row, and we're going to set up the basic frame the same way we would as if it were a regular basic frame. And then we're going to wrap rows 2 through 5. Those are the rows that we need to make in flat basic frame before we start bending. So I'm going to wrap rows 2 through 5 with a round top and round bottom. So we're going to cross over at a 90-degree angle and wrap. And then do the same thing for row 3. And wrap. Alright, so now we've got through row 3 and we need 2 more rows of beads before we do any bending. Now I've got my little disc made up through row 5 here, and now it's time to bend our frame wires. And to do that, I usually flip it so I'm looking at the side of my unit. I'm going to put my little thumb right behind the beadwork, and make sure that you are looking at the back. You don't want to bend your frame wire forward, so make sure that you're looking at the back, which should have a lot more exposed wire than the front. So put my finger on the back, and then I'm going to bend that bottom wire down 90 degrees. So it should be sticking out straight from the bottom of my unit. And I'm going to do the same thing with the top wire. Just going to bend it down. And this one's my working wire here, so ignore that one for a second. So my wires should be sticking straight down out of the bottom of my little disc, and they should be parallel to each other. Alright, now the purpose of a 90-degree angle bend is to make a dome that has straight sides. So we want all of our sides to be fairly even. I'm going to move my beads down from my working wire. I'm going to kind of lift and push on those beads to make sure that I cover that little frame wire as best as I can. With these little domes, there is a tendency to have more wire exposed at your seams, so you need to be really careful about covering those wires. That's actually why I like working with a 26 gauge wire for these smaller sized domes, is because there's less wire bulk and it's easier to cover those frame wires so that you have less of your wraps showing there. Alright, now at this point, we're going to start wrapping rows down these frame wires in order to make the walls of our dome. And the first couple of rows of our dome are going to be a little bit harder to measure out. Now I think I mentioned that the 90-degree angle bend means that we want straight sides on our dome. So we need our rows to kind of sit right below the previous row so that they can go straight down instead of tapering outward. But the first few rows of the walls, the first 2 rows of the walls, are going to sit underneath, but maybe slightly off to the side. It might be a little bit harder to get those directly underneath those rows, and that's fine. So just try to get it as close to being underneath as you can, which for me is about right there. Now, to check this, I would check from the side and from the top. I always measure my rows visually. I feel like that gives me better results than when I try to count, just to make sure that my rows are lined up this way. I'm going to measure to that top wire. Now, with a round wrap on a beehive, I don't tend to actually wrap the wire around those frame wires like I would for a regular basic frame. What I do instead is I kind of hold my working wire tight with my hand, keep tension on that wire, and then I anchor my thumbnail right here, right on the far side of that wire that I'm trying to wrap around. And then I'm going to lift my hand up like this so that I'm not going to run into all these little frame wires here. And then I just spin my disc rather than wrapping the wire. That makes sure that I get a nice tight wrap there, but it also helps make sure that my wrap ends up really flat. I find that with these little dome shapes, if I try to wrap around the frame wire, I usually end up with a more pointed wrap there. So if I do my little thumbnail pushing down on that wire and then spinning it, I get a nice tight wrap, but also a flatter one. All right, now I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to lift and push those beads down, make sure I'm covering that top wire. And then I'm going to rotate my disc. And I'm keeping tension on my beads when I do that. That's just something I do in helping measure out these rows. Now you might need to do a little bit of molding if you see that my rows really aren't looking very circular there. So you might need to do a little bit molding as you go to get a nice shape. All right, so I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. I'm going to try and get that row directly underneath the previous row, but it might be slightly off to the side for these first couple walls of your rows of your wall. And I'm going to do the same thing. I'm going to hold tension on my working wire and then plant my thumbnail on the far side of that bottom wire that I'm trying to wrap around. Lift my hand up so that my thumb can go inside my little dome there, and then spin my component. Now, after every wrap, you want to check these frame wires. They're getting out of that 90-degree angle bend, so I'm going to stop and I'm going to fix them before I move on, because that will affect how you measure out your rows and how they line up nicely. All right, lift and push, cover that frame wire, and I'm going to keep tension on my row and kind of spin my unit there to measure out the next row. Now, if you are using beads that are pretty consistent in size, you might be able to use a count for your walls. I didn't for the first ones just because it's not going to be the same count as the rows that were in front of the wall rows. But with these wall rows with a 90-degree angle bend, your rows should be roughly the same length. So you might be able to use a count. Now, if you see a count in a pattern, don't use that because you might use a slightly different number than the designer did. But you should be able to count your row and get a pretty close number. But don't just blindly accept that that number is going to be exactly what you need. Always double check visually. Make sure that your row, look at the top of your I'm on the underside here. Look at the underside and make sure that those rows are sitting on top of each other visually. Turn it to the side and make sure that those rows are creating a straight wall. And if not, then you might need to adjust that count. All right, so again, anchor my thumb and spin my little beehive. Now, if you ever see that your little dome is turning into more of an oval shape, I usually just kind of pinch. I flatten by squeezing the top and bottom wires together, and that kind of helps me make a round shape as I'm going. I don't just accept whatever shape it wants to make. I am taking control of this wire and making it do what I want it to do. All right, don't just let it flop around and make whatever shapes it wants. Bend it and control it, and make these nice little curves. So again, I'm going to measure out. I just measure visually, but you can count if you want. I'm going to line up on this side. I'm going to line up from the top. I'm going to look straight down, make sure those rows are sitting right on top of each other. And then spin my little component. Now another way you can measure out these rows, this little dome that I'm making is fairly tiny, but with larger sized ones, you might actually be able to fit your finger inside. Now you can have a finger on the inside and a finger on the outside, and you can actually feel for yourself whether those rows are flat and straight beside each other. So that's another method you can use to double check how even your rows are becoming. I forgot to count how many rows I'm doing here. I see it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. So I'm on row 10 right now. I'm going to wrap to the top wire, double check my lengths, double check, make sure my wire is 90-degree angles, and also check from this way too to make sure your wires aren't leaning this way, and make sure they aren't going inward, outward, any direction. So make sure that they're straight and at that 90-degree angle bend. And that spinning motion does take some practice. It's not something that generally just happens to you. It is something that you have to practice. So try not to get too frustrated if it's not working out the first few times that you try it. Like anything else, usually just takes a little bit of practice. And sometimes your rows may not have a nice measurement where everything looks perfectly even. Like with this row here, if I went this way, it's a little bit smaller than this row, than the previous row. But if I add an extra bead, it's a little bit longer. So sometimes it's not exactly perfect, and you just kind of have to choose which one you think is the closest that will get you the best results. Again, I'm molding that row into a nice circular shape. I'm not just letting it do whatever the heck it wants. I think this is row 13. We're going to pretend it is just in case it isn't. All right. Now, last row of my little dome. I'm going to double wrap at that bottom wire. And we're reducing to one bottom wire. So I'm going to very carefully remove that working wire after I've double wrapped there to secure. And if you have any twists in that bottom wire, you need to open that up. And then very, very carefully trim just one of these wires in your bottom wire, leaving the other one attached. And I made that way too long. All right. Now, in order to make the stem wire under our beehive, I told you to leave the top wire attached. If you don't have that top wire here, you're just going to be attaching it to your stem on this side over here, which makes it hard to center your beehive, but it also makes it so that your dome can be pulled up and bend back and forth, which just isn't very secure. So you leave that top wire connected, and then we're going to bring them together on the underside. And you want to be very careful when you do this, that you don't squeeze it too tightly, because that's going to possibly mingle your rows and turn it into more of an oval shape than a circle. So very gently pull those tail wires together below in the middle of your little dome, and we're just going to twist them together and try to get it as close to the center as you can. And there we have our little finished dome. All right, now let's take a look at a 45-degree angle bend. So again, I'm going to look at the side, and I'm just going to bend them back just about halfway between where it was flat and where straight down would be. So about 45 degrees there. I'm going to do the same thing on the other side. Now the point of a 45-degree angle bend is to make a dome with tapered sides. So they're going to slant outward a little bit, and that means the number of beads per row is actually going to increase every time we go down. All right. Now I find it's even easier for the 45-degree angle bends to move out of place, so you got to keep an eye on them. It's also important to note here that even though we're bending at a 45-degree angle, we are still wrapping at a 90-degree angle. So what I like to do is to kind of tilt my little frame so that my top wire is sticking straight up. All right, so it's going to stick straight up. That way, that helps me to wrap. When I rotate, I can rotate at an angle rather than with the disc flat. I rotate at an angle. That just helps me to keep those frame wires in a little bit more of a 45-degree angle. So tilt and spin. Again, I'm going to check every single time. Now with a 90-degree angle, we wanted, the 90-degree angle bend, we wanted straight sides, so our rows would stack directly underneath each other. This time, with the 45-degree angle, we want them to be out a little bit and not directly underneath each other. So they're going to be underneath, but off to the side, so that our rows can grow, and then our dome becomes wider at the base as we go down. So if you're using a count, you will need to add, I don't even know how many beads it is because I don't count my rows. I line things up visually. But you would have to add, I'm going to assume it's like 1 or 2 beads for every round. All right, so the 2 rows in this round are going to be roughly the same count, and then we'll increase again. I'm going to check to make sure that my little wires are still at that 45-degree angle bend. And then I'm going to wrap again, and again I want my rows to come out from the previous row and not sit directly below. You can check from the side. See how they're slanting outward instead of going straight. You can check from the top to make sure that they are going outward. And then wrap. And I am taking the time to mold my rows into a nice curved shape. I don't want them to get all wonkified, so I am taking the time to mold my rows as I go, just as I would with any basic frame. Previous row. And I do want to check to make sure that my slope is kind of an even slope and it's sloping the same with every row, rather than this row kind of jutting out further than the other ones do. So the same rate of increase every time. And there I have my little dome with slanted sides. So if we compare that to the straight sides, that's going to be the difference in the shape that you make with a 90-degree angle versus a 45-degree angle bend. All right, now that's it for the demo of the dome shapes for bent basic frame. Now, most people call these beehives. And I have up until this point, just because that's the traditional name for the technique. That's how it's usually used, is to make these little dome-shaped centers, and I guess people just decided to call them beehives. But there's lots of domes that you can make that don't look anything like beehives. So I don't particularly like that term. I've always hated having to write that in my pattern. So I recently just decided if I'm going to be spending this much of my time teaching something, I want to teach it in the way that makes the most sense to me. So I'm going to be using bent basic frame from now on to do these shapes. Now, another reason that I don't like the term beehive is because there's more that you can do with bent basic frame. That same process of bending those frame wires can make other shapes other than semi-beehive looking domes. All right. Now these, I call these boats, these little boat shapes, because when you turn them this way, they look like little boats. But these are just 2 examples. There are other little boat shapes that you can make by bending frame wires backward. Let me talk about these ones here, because I know you guys love it when I ramble on and talk forever. All right, so this one I bent my frame wires at a 45-degree angle. Both the top and bottom wire bent at a 45-degree angle, and I also wrapped at a 45-degree angle so I get these pointed ends. I could have done a round wrap and gotten an even different shape with that 45-degree angle bend. With this one, I did a 90-degree angle bend, so my rows are straight and roughly the same length in all of my little wall rows. Whereas the 45-degree angle one, again, of course, makes slanted walls that kind of increase with every round. 90-degree angle bend, they should stay roughly the same. And then I also did a 90-degree angle wrap to get rounded ends on my little petals. Now I could have done, you can do a 90-degree angle bend on one of the frame wires and a 45-degree angle bend on the other. You can have 2 different bending angles. You can have 2 different wrapping angles. I could have done round at the bottom and pointed at the top. So there's other shapes that you can make by bending frame wires that look absolutely nothing like a dome or a beehive. All right, now that's going to conclude my part 1 lesson on bent basic frame. Yes, there's more. Part 2, and the last video in my intermediate technique series, we're going to talk about cupping petals like this. And this is basically bending frame wire, just one of the frame wires. And the process is different enough from my little domes that I felt like they deserve their own video. So that's going to be the last video in my series, and I hope you guys will tune in next week where we'll be talking about these. Until then, happy beading!